We're going to call to order the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. At the conclusion of opening statements yesterday, the chair called up H.R. 4889. The bill was open for amendment at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to this bill? Yeah. Are there other amendments to H.R. 4889? Chair recognizes, for what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
To offer an amendment number 01, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4889, offered by Mr. Pallone. Strike all after.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. And while they distribute the amendment, Mr. Pallone, if you'd like to go ahead for 5 minutes in support of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I won't need all the time. Last Congress, the committee considered another version of the Kelsey-Smith Act and voted that bill out of committee on a voice vote. But we're not considering that version today. Today, the bill before us, H.R. 4889, does not follow the framework of that compromise, and the bill disregards this committee's hard work on the Kelsey-Smith Act, in my opinion. When the committee first considered the act, it heard concerns about the bill's potential risk to consumers' privacy and Fourth Amendment rights. The committee worked together in a bipartisan way to address some of those concerns and favorably reported the Kelsey-Smith Act to the floor of the House. This amendment would offer another opportunity to take up the compromise that was worked out last Congress. That amendment requires that 48 hours after law enforcement makes an emergency request, that the officer making that request seek a court order stating whether he or she had probable cause to believe that there was, in fact, an emergency. As a result, the bill addresses some of the concerns that civil liberties groups have raised regarding potential abuse of H.R. 4889, while also ensuring that law enforcement have quick access to life-saving location data when they're presented with an emergency situation. Let me be clear that nothing in this bill would stop law enforcement from acting swiftly to get the accurate location data needed to respond to life-threatening emergency. That's a goal that we all agree on. If we can't agree, however, Mr. Chairman, on our prior work or to build on our prior work, perhaps we can work together as we move towards full committee markup. But I would like to address some of these civil liberties concerns, and this is the way that we had thought we could do it on a bipartisan basis. So I would urge members to support these efforts and yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. I would rise in opposition to the amendment. I appreciate the gentleman's strong support of the legislation that I helped offer last time. Subsequent to that, we learned a few things about the bill that caused consternation, frankly, among sheriffs and others in my own state. And that's why we modeled this newer bill after what passed in Oregon unanimously in the House and the Senate and signed by the governor, all of whom, by the way, I don't have to say too loudly, are all Democrats. So everything's run by the Democrats out there, which brings joy to your heart, I'm sure. But we think it's a balanced piece of legislation we brought before. And the other piece of this is that it does have that liability protection for the carriers so that you don't have some customer representative wondering whether or not they're going to have some liability here if they comply. So I would urge my colleagues to oppose the gentleman's amendment.
Mr. Chairman, would you, if you're done, I just was going to ask you to yield a minute.
Sure.
Again, I understand your position, but I did want to mention that the idea here is not to suppress any evidence that resulted from, the law enforcement activity. That would not be the case, but rather just to provide some deterrent to unlawful police activity. That's what the civil liberties groups are concerned about. So I just wanted to mention that or add to my comments in that regard, Mr. Chairman.
I appreciate that. And I would yield back the balance of my time. Are there other members seeking recognition on the gentleman's amendment? Seeing none. The question now arises. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The noes appear to have it. The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments at the desk? Why, yes, there are. We'll pull up the Walden amendment, please.
Amendment to H.R. 4889, offered by Mr. Walden.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes in support of the amendment. This is the fixes that we did to the other bill that put in the liability protection provision that was an issue that came to our attention, because once again, you don't want the account reps not cooperating and all because of fear of liability. And so that's what our amendment does. I think it has merit and should achieve bipartisan support. And I would encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support it. And I yield back the balance of my time. Are there other members seeking recognition on this amendment?
Thank you.
Seeing none, the question now comes on the amendment. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 4889 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported. And I want to recognize the Smiths who are in the audience today. Thank you for your participation in this process. And the bill is favorably reported. Chair now calls up H.R. 4167. Ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 4167, to amend the Communications Act of 1934 to require multi-lane telephone systems to have default configurations that permit users to initiate call to 911 without dialing any.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to this piece of legislation? Are there amendments? Any amendments members want to offer? I recognize the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that this has the potential for a bipartisan amendment, and I believe it's at the desk. Do you have the amendment at the desk? It's MLTS/01.
Yeah, before you, yeah. If the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4167, offered by Ms. Eshoo of California.
Without objection, first reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the chair recognizes the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I was saying, this, I think, has the potential to be a bipartisan amendment. And let me just outline what this would do. Kerry's law addresses a very, very serious problem, and I think everyone understands that here at the committee. When you dial 911 from a hotel or an office, when split seconds really matter, you shouldn't have to dial 9 or some other prefix to get help. So I strongly support, and I know that my colleagues on this side, we all support the overall goals of the bill. But I want to point out where I think there is a deficiency, and that is relative to location accuracy for multi-line telephone systems is really just as important as what I just stated. Once your call reaches a 911 call center, the people answering the phones have to know where you are to dispatch first responders. It was an honor to have the families of those who lost their lives come and testify before us on 911. And I think that if there were a witness from a family on location technology, everybody would just automatically say, yes, we should do this. So what this amendment does is that it requires the FCC, because we don't know how to do this amongst ourselves, to initiate a proceeding on location accuracy within 180 days of this bill becoming law. The amendment says that nothing about what that proceeding at the FCC should look at and what the FCC would require. They have the expertise to do this. And The FCC has already requested and received public comment on the ability and the feasibility of the MLTS, the multi-line telephone systems, to provide precise location information for 911 callers. At least 16 states have already passed laws or issued regulations requiring enhanced 911 service for MLTS. So I think that this is an appropriate moment for us to direct the FCC, which I described, this initiative on location accuracy, and I don't think we should let this opportunity slip through our fingertips. So I know I spoke to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, who's a wonderful co-chair of the Next Gen 911 Caucus, and I don't know if he's prepared to make any remarks on it, but I
If the
know
gentlelady would lead.
yes, I'd be happy to.
I want to thank her for the work, and just imagine, I mean, we have these systems here in the building. So what the request is that when someone can immediately access 911, that then we would know which room it would be in. So I think it's got great merit to it, and I think it's something that I think if we give it some time, we can bring a bipartisan amendment if we do due diligence and look at the language, and then also some other due diligence. I look forward to working with her. We have had a great ride in helping the public safety and the 911 community respond, and I hope that we can continue that with as we move to the full committee.
I thank the gentleman. We'll work together. It's a very short, one page, maybe five lines, and with your commitment to work this out before we go to full committee, I'll withdraw my amendment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady withdraws her amendment, yields back her time. Are there other amendments to the legislation? If not, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 4167 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Chair now calls up H.R. 4111 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 4111, to include skilled nursing facilities as a type of healthcare provider under Section 254H of Communications Act of 19...
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to this legislation? Are there any other amendments to the bill? Anyone? The gentleman seeks to strike the last word and is recognized from Iowa. Mr. Loebsack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the committee for bringing up H.R. 4111, the Rural Health Care Connectivity Act, which I am proud to co-sponsor along with Congressman Lance and Congressman Kramer, and I thank both of you for your wonderful work on this. This common sense bill would allow skilled nursing facilities to be eligible for universal service funding through the Rural Health Care Program. In rural areas like my district in Iowa, it can be difficult for patients to get the health care that they need without driving long distances. That is why innovations like telemedicine are so important to Iowa families and other rural families as well. Unfortunately, it can be difficult, it can be expensive for providers to get the broadband access they need to provide these services to patients. And this bill would allow skilled nursing facilities to offer improved care options and services to our rural communities. Skilled nursing facilities offer long-term care to seniors, and in rural areas may be the only health care providers close by. These facilities provide much needed care to aging populations and need to be able to develop and utilize the full range of telehealth opportunities that are out there. Just last week, I visited with Wilton Care Center, a skilled nursing facility in my district, and I heard about how critical internet access is for them so that they can offer the best care possible for their patients. And in particular, they explained how difficult it can be to transport the patients that live at their facility to a hospital or another doctor, and how telehealth technologies allow them to save a potentially dangerous and disruptive trip that could take up to an hour while getting patients the care and service that they need. And it's facilities like the Wilton Care Center that need robust and affordable broadband so they can best serve their patients, and I'm glad that we're working towards that goal. And I thank the committee and the chairman, and in particular Mr. Lance, Mr. Kramer for working on this, and I yield back. Thank you, Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Loebsack. Let me say that health care should not be based upon where one lives, and this is a country that includes many rural areas, and this applies only to public or nonprofit entities, and it is a step in the right direction for the better health of the entire nation, including those of our residents and citizens who live in rural America. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Are there other members seeking recognition? Seeing none. The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 4111 to the full committee. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported. Chair now calls up H.R. 4190 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 4190, to promote innovation, investment, and economic growth by accelerating spectrum efficiencies through the challenging prize competition.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to this bill? Are there any other amendments to this bill? Does anyone want to speak on this bill?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to strike the left.
Chair recognized gentlelady from California, Ms. Matsui.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased the subcommittee is considering my legislation today, H.R. 4190, the Spectrum Challenge Prize Act of 2015. The U.S. has always been a global leader in wireless technologies, but we need to continue to innovate in order for our wireless economy to continue to grow. Spectrum is invisible infrastructure of the 21st century, and we need to pursue every avenue to ensure that we can meet the growing demand of the mobile economy. I work with my colleague, Representative Guthrie, and many members of the subcommittee to free up some of the airwaves used by the federal government. Spectrum is a finite resource, so we also need new technological approaches to encourage greater efficiencies. My challenge prize legislation, which I introduced with Senator Tom Udall, would encourage wireless innovation by creating a federal Spectrum Challenge Prize. The Spectrum Challenge competition would help incentivize innovators and entrepreneurs to develop technologies that eclipse the current state of the art. Challenge prizes have a long track record of spurring innovation. The driverless, for instance, like the driverless car technology. The Spectrum Challenge Prize Act creates a new opportunity for the federal government and the private sector to work collaboratively in this pursuit of a spectrum efficiency breakthrough, which is ultimately a victory for American consumers. I urge all my colleagues to support this legislation. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any other members seeking time? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 4190 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. 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 Those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Chair calls up H.R. 3998 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 3998, to direct the Federal Communications Commission to commence proceedings related to the resiliency of critical telecommunications networks during the time of emergency.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments? Are there any amendments? Mr. Pallone, do you want to strike the last word?
Not if you're supportive.
I'm supportive.
Then I have nothing to say. Thank you.
All right. Well, okay. Any other members seeking recognition or not seeking recognition? With that, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 3998 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. And that bill is also favorably reported to the full committee. The chair calls up H.R. 2031 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 2031, to amend the Communications Act.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments? There are none, right? Are there other amendments? Apparently not. Question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 2031 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Chair calls up H.R. 4884 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 4884, to amend the Communications Act.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments? Are there other amendments? The chair, for what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4884.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. And the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm disappointed my Republican colleagues are bringing up H.R. 4884, the Curb Lifeline Act. 3 weeks ago, the FCC took a major step forward to close the digital divide. The Lifeline program will now support broadband connectivity and help low-income households get and stay connected to the communication services they need to participate in the 21st century economy. Just as we are celebrating this progress for struggling families across the country, our Republican colleagues are pushing legislation that'll take us backwards. Low-income families in every community have so many demands on their household budgets, whether it is the cost of childcare, transportation, or housing. We know that hard conversations about how to stretch paychecks each month are happening at kitchen tables across our nation. The Curb Lifeline Act could prevent millions of low-income Americans from receiving the assistance they need to get connected and to be full participants in our 21st century economy. Rather than cut and cap the Lifeline program, my amendment would build upon the work the FCC has done to expand the program to broadband and strengthen our efforts to promote broadband adoption. Instead of talking about how to artificially limit the number of people Lifeline can serve, we should be thinking creatively about how we can help remove the barriers to getting online faced by our seniors, veterans, and families with school-age children. I urge all my colleagues to vote for my amendment and stand up for the millions of Americans who could use Lifeline to help lift themselves out of poverty. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back balance for time. Anyone seeking time in opposition to the amendment? If not, I will. The amendment strikes the entire base text of H.R. 4884 and instead replaces it with an FCC proceeding that will almost inevitably lead to greater spending on Lifeline. The amendment instructs the FCC to consider the following factors when calculating the amount of assistance consumers: market price for broadband internet access service, speeds of service adopted by households, usage patterns of residential customers, and minimum service standards adopted by the FCC. These factors as a whole will almost certainly result in the Commission determining that a higher subsidy amount is necessary, which will further expand the fund and raise rates for those who pay the rate. Current amount of $9.25 per subscriber was set in 2012. The Lifeline program is intended to be a discount for low-income consumers, not a payment to fully cover broadband or voice service. It was to be a subsidy, a discount. The amendment also explicitly prohibits the FCC from discontinuing standalone mobile voice service within the program. However, the FCC has already adopted an order that phases out mobile voice service. This amendment does the opposite of both the base bill and the Commission's own actions. This amendment not only fails to cap the program or control spending, but instead would likely lead to increased spending, and therefore I must oppose the amendment. And I yield back the balance of my time. Are there other members seeking recognition? Recognize the gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I'm just confused about what's going on here, because I think we all recognize that the Lifeline program is very important for low-income people, that all in all it's been a success, And I think that it's clear that Ms. Matsui, even though you disagree, is making an effort to essentially make, a good program or a program that has worked, maybe has some faults, better. And it seems to me that that's a much preferable alternative to the bill, because the bill effectively is going to eliminate this service for the people that need it most. And so for the life of me, I'm not looking to, have a dialogue right now, but I just, for the life of me, don't understand why her proposal, or maybe something like it, can't be the basis for an agreement on how to make this program better, that we could work on a bipartisan basis, rather than this, taking an axe, which is what I think the GOP is doing, to what is a very important program. So I'm just a little taken aback, I guess, by the fact that the GOP, the Republicans, are simply, sort of taking an axe to this. And, when we have something like Ms. Matsui's amendment or substitute that would actually make the program better, and I think address some of the concerns, that we don't move in that direction. But I know that's not where we're going today, so I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields the balance of his time. Chair recognizes the Vice Chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Latta.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to strike the last word and yield to the chairman.
Appreciate that. And I'd just like to say that I don't believe we're taking an axe to this program. I think you can find, as we've both said, both sides of the aisle, there's very important service being provided to low-income people through this program. But I think we also have to acknowledge there have been many cases of waste, fraud, a lot of fraud, and abuse. And in fact, as I think all of us discussed, or some of us did at the subcommittee hearing, the FCC's recent action against Total Call Mobile for allegedly defrauding the Lifeline Fund, they got fined $51 million. Now, what's interesting, upon further investigation, Total Call enrolled at least 32,000 duplicate Lifeline consumers in the program. They were able to override the National Lifeline Accountability Database, which is used to identify duplicates. So they overrode the database that was supposed to be in place to prevent this from happening. Total Call enrolled ineligible consumers into the Lifeline program. This is why we think there needs to be a cap until this fraud gets weeded out of this. How long did this go on? We now know, according to the FCC itself, that this fraud went on in 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016. When did the FCC become aware of this activity? Since the first FCC subpoena was issued on November 10th, 2014, we know they became aware of it sometime before that. In other words, the FCC knew about the fraud, and it appears let it continue for at least 17 months. Because the FCC did not release the proposed forfeiture until April of this year, this month, it appears the majority of the fraudulent activity will actually go unpunished because the FCC failed to take action within the statute of limitations. So it dragged on so long, they didn't take action, and now they can't take action, and most of the fraud will not be, they will not go after it. According to Commissioner Pai, the commissioners were told that the massive fraud could not be disclosed publicly until after April 1st. Now, this is really important. That was the day after the majority voted to expand the program to broadband and rejected the imposition of a cap on the fund. As we know, there was a bipartisan tentative agreement at the commission to put a cap on the fund. Somehow they delayed the vote for more than 3 hours, I think, or 3 times, while that agreement fell apart. What happened behind all those closed doors, I wasn't a party to, I don't know, but it's unfortunate. According to Commissioner Pai, the investigation had largely concluded in mid-2015. In an April 18th letter to USAC, Commissioner Pai disclosed that Total Call was not the only company defrauding the Lifeline program. 4 other companies are engaged, apparently, in the same fraudulent practices as Total Call. 4 other companies. The facts and circumstances underlining the notice of apparent liability raise a number of significant issues. The timeline of the FCC's actions and inaction suggests the possibility that something was going on down there at the FCC. that they didn't want this released, but interestingly enough, it was released the day after the commissioners had to vote on this expansion of the program. All this is to say, a lot of us hear from our constituents, and I've heard from a lot of members, including Mr. Scott on multiple occasions, about circumstances in their communities where this program has been abused by companies allegedly like Total Call. And yet they're still engaged in this activity. What we're trying to do here is clean this up so that people who actually are eligible and need the help get the resources, and that this isn't some open-ended checkbook where ratepayers get the bill. These companies that are defrauding the system get paid and walk away, and people who need the help may not get it. So we're trying to put a cap in place that is reasonable and balanced. We're trying to build on the reforms this commission has taken already, but this latest example of delay in disclosure, delay in prosecution, and further evidence of fairly substantial abuse. If they're signing up 32,000 people fraudulently, and they were able to override the very system the FCC had in place to prevent that, there's a problem. There's a problem. And all we're saying is let's cap this program to protect ratepayers, but it's still at a $1.5 billion. That's not an insignificant amount of subsidy. So with that, I yield back the balance of my time. And I recognize the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Couldn't wait to debate this. There are several things that you said, and there are several things that you haven't said. There isn't one person on this side, or the entire committee, for that matter, that supports any kind of abuse or fraud or any of that. I was one of the first on our subcommittee to go after this, committed to it. Why? Because every dollar is really precious. And in this program, it's extra precious. Why? Because these are the poorest people in the country. All right? Now, I know you have issues with the FCC. I know that every time the Oracle, Mr. Pai speaks, everybody jumps up and down. But you know what? Mr. Pai's service, he's not going to lose a damn thing in this. But our constituents are. If you're going to cut off the lifeline, and I said this in my opening statement yesterday, this is truly the lifeline for people that live in poverty. So if you don't like the FCC, that's one thing. Why are we punishing our own constituents? Why do that? It is their lifeline. Or do they have second or third class citizenship? This program, this Lifeline program, was born out of universal service. This program was born and supported by the Reagan administration. This program was expanded during the George W. Bush administration. And these are phone companies or private sector outfits that are committing the fraud. Right. And the FCC is doing the right thing. They just fined this outfit, what, $51 million? Well, I wish they had done it sooner. But it takes time to build a case, to go after people, to prosecute them. But we're doing something different here. We're doing something different here. We're ripping their lifeline away. I think every single member of this committee, for 1 month, operate without your computer in your pocket and see how you would succeed. Would you be able to do your job? Would you be able to communicate with your family? In many cases, we're thousands of miles away from them. Would you be able to correspond with your office? Could you negotiate anything with the details? So, you know what? Just because someone is poor, they shouldn't be kicked. And I have to say that this is, I don't think that this is in your DNA, Mr. Chairman. I understand trying to streamline, make things better, push on an agency to do more. But you know what the bill does, and the reason why Ms. Matsui is offering this, and in all, it really is like an underline, you know, a substitute, I think is for the reasons that I'm stating. Why are we hurting these people? What did they ever do to you that you want to do this to them? Don't do this. You're going to be taking away 911 services from them. Who wants to answer for that? Come on. We're better than this. We really are better than this. I'm disappointed that this is the form of the bill that's come up, and maybe someone in the middle of the night is going to wake up and say, let's have some heart in this. We can be accountable, we can handle going after the fraud, but we should not abuse people in our country. We shouldn't be abusing people and taking services away from them. This is not a waste of money. This is their lifeline. Just because we have ours, it's so easy to sit here like princes and princesses and say we're going to judge them. So obviously, I oppose this effort. I think it's a sad one. I think it's a hurtful one, and I don't want to have anything to do with it because it's just, to me, is so stark in terms of what it's going to do to people. So with that, I have 27 seconds. You can be happy to yield.
Would you yield? No, I just say if you want to take care of the fraud, if a company does what that company you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, kick them off the program. Don't allow them to participate in Lifeline. Let's penalize the people that are committing fraud. Fine them $51 million or whatever it is and tell them you're no longer allowed to sell telephones in a Lifeline program. But let's not hurt poor people.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? I need to check on this side. Chair recognizes gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I move to strike the last word. And I'd like to yield my time to Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle. I just want to say one thing in general and then specifically something about this total call mobile case that the chairman mentions. What I hear the chairman saying is that this bill is designed to try to force some kind of action to prevent fraud and abuse. But I don't see any way that a cap is going to accomplish that. I really don't. I don't even understand the theory that say, okay, we're going to cap this, making all these poor people suffer the way Ms. Eshu so eloquently described, and then somehow that's going to reform the system. It seems to me that there's no reason to believe that. But I did want to mention with regard, I know that the chairman and some of our colleagues on the Republican side are concerned about the timing of this recent enforcement action the FCC took against Total Call Mobile for overbilling the program. And I just wanted to lay out what I consider the facts in this case. First, it's not clear that the FCC could have moved any faster than it did. As recently as December, the FCC was still collecting, as part of its investigation, thousands of pages of documents from the company. After the FCC collected the documents, it had to review them and circulate a draft action to the commissioners. And at that point, commissioners often take weeks to review the case, making any changes they see fit, and then they vote. And we're only in April now, which I think is a reasonable time frame. But again, all this misses the point. The FCC has already said publicly that the Inspector General dictated the timing in this case, not the chairman. And while none of us here know the details of the Inspector General's involvement, I just think we should be a little cautious about saying anything here that interferes with the independent investigation or suggests that somehow it's the FCC's fault over the timing. But again, I think all this kind of misses the point. I don't understand how this bill is going to effectuate any positive changes to the programs. It seems to me, again, it's just an axe to the program. And if we actually listened in some detail to what Ms. Matsui is proposing, she's actually proposing a method to achieve a better program, which is, I think, what the Republicans are talking about. And even if you don't like exactly what she's saying in this amendment, that's the way to go, not just doing the cap. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Doyle. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Anyone
yield
else
back.
seeking time? No one else seeking time. The question now comes on passage of the amendment. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Nay. The nays appear to have it. The nays have it, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise votes no. Ms. Blackburn? Ms. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Lance? Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson? Mr. Pompeo? Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Bilirakis? Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Long? Mr. Long votes no. Ms. Elmers? Ms. Elmers votes no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Kramer? Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton votes no. Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle votes aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth? Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack? Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Rush? Ms. DeGette? Mr. Butterfield? Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes aye. Chairman Walden? Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Lance votes no. Anyone else?
Thank you. Are there other members not recorded? The clerk, Mr. Butterfield.
Mr. Butterfield, you are not recorded. Mr. Butterfield votes aye.
Mr. Pompeo.
Mr. Pompeo votes no.
Are there other members not recorded? Not, the clerk will report the results.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 11 ayes and 16 noes.
11 ayes, 16 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Mr. Yarmouth, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment. Mr. Yarmouth. Oh, you have two of them, Mr. Yarmouth. Which
I have
one?
two. This is the first one. 6B, cap date
That's
6B.
Thank you. That will help the clerks.
Oh, I'm
Amendment
sorry,
to
cap study, 01. Yeah.
Reserve it, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
reserve point of order.
Gentleman reserves point of order against the amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4884, offered by Mr. Yarmouth.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this amendment actually relates to the discussion we just had. As we know, the underlying bill arbitrarily caps funding for Lifeline, which will be the first time the program would be capped since it was created in 1984. What my amendment would do is direct the GAO to conduct a study to find out if such a cap will in fact have any impact on reducing waste, fraud, or abuse within this program. As we recall from the hearing the other day, the witness from Americans for Prosperity, who testified about the need for caps, gave one of the fundamental reasons to impose caps, that it would reduce fraud, waste, and abuse. When I asked her if she had any evidence that caps in this program or any other program actually did, in fact, reduce fraud, waste, and abuse, she could not answer and promised to get me information if she had it. I don't suspect that we have that yet. So I think what's important is, as the chairman stated, and I totally agree with him, we have to do everything we can to root out all the inefficiencies in any federal program. As a matter of fact, I wrote an op-ed last week in which I made the case that Democrats
Would the gentleman suspend for just a moment?
Yes.
Because apparently we ended up with the wrong amendment. It's the cap study 01.
Cap Study 01. Right.
And the majority is prepared to accept your amendment,
Oh, well, wonderful.
unless you want to keep going.
No, I think this is a worthy thing. I congratulate the majority for endorsing such a sound concept that we ought to know.
All right, you're starting to lose votes.
I yield back. I yield back.
I recognize the gentleman from Illinois.
I withdraw the point of order.
Gentleman withdraws his point of order. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Are there other amendments?
Congrats.
Seeing none.
Mr. Chairman?
Well, it's open.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I have an amendment at the desk.
All right. Chair recognizes gentle lady from New York. Which
Cap
amendment?
807.
Caps 807.
Mr. Chairman,
Clerk,
let's reserve point of order.
gentleman reserves point of order. So is clerk familiar? Cap 807.
Cap date 07.
Cap date 07. Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentle lady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment to H.R. 4884 is simple. My amendment suspends the bill's cap on Lifeline until the FCC can certify that this cap will not adversely affect Americans in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. My Republican colleagues have said that being connected is vital to participating in our increasingly digital society. This amendment ensures that the cap would not disconnect SNAP recipients so that they too can participate. SNAP is an integral part of Lifeline. 38% of all Lifeline recipients qualify for the program through SNAP. The number of Americans that need SNAP rises during economic downturns and falls when the economy improves. Historically, SNAP has been one of the most responsive federal programs in assisting families during economic downturns. Taking away Lifeline support from SNAP recipients means taking away support from some of the most vulnerable in our society. Close to 2/3 of SNAP recipients are children, elderly, or disabled. Nearly half, 2/5 of SNAP benefits go to households that make less than 50% of the federal poverty level. So I urge my colleagues to support my amendment. Protecting these vulnerable, low-income Americans is something we should all be able to agree on. We should be working to lift all Americans up, and we will not allow an artificial statutory cap on the Lifeline program to take resources away from those that have so very little to begin with. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of the time. The member seeking recognition on the Clark amendment? If not, the chair will recognize himself. And I call on my colleagues to oppose this amendment and the subsequent amendments that are all basically the same thing. That it's a way to prevent this cap from ever taking place, because if you have to rely on the FCC to do a report and report back to Congress before anything happens, we know the FCC's track record is pretty abysmal. For example, it's been 3,045 days, December 18th of 2007 to be exact, since the FCC last issued its statutorily required quadrennial review of media ownership rules. That's more than 8 years ago. The report is mandated by law to be produced every 4 years. This FCC hasn't produced this statutorily mandated report for the entirety of the Obama administration, even though we've called on them to do that here when they've testified, and yet it never seems to happen. So the amendments that the majority are putting forward simply call for new studies and reports from the FCC time and time again, preventing this cap from being put in place. I understand you're opposed to the cap. I understand you don't believe that a cap on this fund will bring about any kind of reforms that are so very needed. And the other point worth making, this is the only one of these funds that doesn't have a cap. All the other funds have caps, except this one. And we think it is prudent on the Republican side to have a cap on this one. It doesn't mean it can't be revisited. We do know, as a matter of fact, that there is fraud in this program. There are fraudulent operators. There are fraudulent takers up of this program. And we have to continue to do the reforms because there's another group of people out there who actually pay this bill. They're called the ratepayers. It's on your phone bill. And they're getting pretty fed up with the news reports that in virtually every major U.S. city about phones being given out to people, multiple phones. At one point, nearly 99% of the sign-ups by Total Mobile were fraudulent. 99%. They were busting through the phone database there you're supposed to check against. The protocols in place by the FCC, they were getting around them. And I think we also, and I've made it clear all along that I support helping those in low income get access to the internet, helping them get access to phone, making sure their kids have that. We're already going to spend $1.5 billion to do that. But we have this other obligation and responsibility to those who are actually paying the bill to get at the waste and fraud that is clearly evident and evidenced by this latest fine, even though apparently it went on for 3 years and they missed the statute of limitation to go after the bulk of it. And by the way, I'm told this company is still in the program, which is sort of shocking, and have paid a $51 million, or been notice of parent liability, $51 million. So I would call on my colleagues, each of these amendments, the same thing, only they've divided them up to be veterans and SNAP recipients and rural areas and all those sorts of things. The underlying point is the same, and that is no cap, no limit, no spending control. Because the order that got adopted at the FCC has a false budget cap in it. It just says if we get up against what we think the budget might be, then you have to tell us, and then we have multiple months to figure out if there's an issue. I think ratepayers deserve some protection here, too. I think the people paying the bill deserve protection, too. Just like I think those that need help most among us need support. But I'm willing to do both. Help the low income who need access to the internet. And I got to take a little offense when others say that somehow we on this side of the aisle are somehow against helping the poor. I've done a lot of work to help the poor, and I'll continue to. But I also am not going to be so blinded as to not help the ratepayers who are paying the bill. So I oppose this amendment, and I will oppose the other. Certainly I'd yield to my friend.
Mr. Chairman, why can't we do both? Why can't we do both?
We can.
That was my point. Yeah, but when you...
Is there a cap? Reclaiming my time. Is there any cap number that you would support?
I'd sit down and talk about it, but I think that we need to know how many people are going to be...
You think there is a...
How many people are going to be left out of this? Because it's the bill is arbitrary in terms of cutting people off.
So there is
I'm a ratepayer. We're all ratepayers.
Reclaiming my time. So there is a cap number you think you could get to?
Take care of the people.
I see Mr. Pallone shaking his head in opposition.
Take care of people, I'll be satisfied. But I think what's built into this thing is dangerous. I really do.
My time's expired.
Thank you.
Others seeking time. Mr. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
I'm not going to, keep beating up here, but I just, again, I don't understand how the cap accomplishes any of these goals. And, the reason why we have these series of amendments that reference various people who are going to be really negatively impacted is, starting with SNAP recipients, veterans, different categories that the chairman mentioned that are the subject of these different Democratic amendments, is because we're trying to highlight how the negative impact on these different groups. I mean, we all say we support veterans. We all say that we want to help, people who are poor find a job and have a better life and have all kinds of opportunities. But the bottom line is that they're going to be really negatively impacted in their ability to do that. For low-income Americans, this is how if they're unemployed and they're looking to find a job, this is how, the phone is what they use to find a job. If you're a victim of domestic violence, you call loved ones for help. If you have to call 911 in an emergency. In this case, the gentleman from New York is talking about SNAP. 38% of Lifeline subscribers are eligible through SNAP, which provides nutrition assistance to millions of eligible low-income individuals. 23% of SNAP households are single adult households where there's a female head of household, and the bill would exacerbate the homework gap. Only 45% of school-age children in households that may qualify for SNAP benefits use the internet at home in 2013, compared with 70% of their peers in higher income households. I've heard the chairman, and again, I'm not trying to be personal about it, but I've heard you talk about the need to expand broadband. The president has talked about expanding it in rural areas and urban areas where we have poor people. Well, you know, because of the homework gap. The FCC, I think it was Commissioner Rosen-Swarcel who specifically mentioned that when she came here. But all we're doing is making things worse, not better. So what I don't understand, Mr. Chairman, just explain to me how you expect a cap to accomplish the goal. How is that going to accomplish the goal? I mean, just explain that to me, because I don't understand.
Sure. You yield?
Yeah, of course.
So in most programs, we have a cap. We have it in all of our budgeting. We have an authorized amount, then we have an appropriated amount. These are the policy choices we make based on what we think the program should do.
But how is that going to, if I could take back my time,
Sure.
how is that going to accomplish the goal of ending the fraud and abuse that you've talked about? How?
Well, so there's two things here. One is, and I've commended Chairman Wheeler and the commission for the work they have done heretofore to tighten down the program. I've said it publicly from this dais. I've said it privately to the chairman. I think they've done a lot of good work. Clearly, there still remains a lot of waste and fraud. We've just seen that. And apparently, there are other companies that are engaged in it, and that was what Commissioner Pai's letter to USAC says. Please give me the data on these other companies and trying to figure out how much fraud is going on there. So it's not necessarily that the cap itself gets at fraud, but at some point, programs are authorized at a certain level, and in fact, all the other funds are capped, except this one. And we think it's prudent to cap this as we work over here, because there are people every month on their phone bill, take a look at it, subsidizing this. And if there's no cap, then there's no end, and the FCC can expand this to anything, anywhere, anytime, and a future FCC could open the door, and then there's no protection for the people paying the bill because it's open-ended.
I understand.
It's right now an open-ended.
Let me just reclaim my time. I understand the criticism you have. I understand some of the things you've cited. But I don't think that you've explained how the cap accomplishes the goal of weeding out the fraud and abuse. I just don't see it. I'm seeing no precedent whereby having a cap in place is going to accomplish that goal. All I think it does is to hurt these people. And the gentlewoman from New York is talking about the lowest income people with SNAP, the kids who aren't going to have access to do their homework. I don't understand. I understand that there's a problem. I don't understand how this does anything to correct it, but I'll yield back. I support the gentlewoman's amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you bringing this bill. I really appreciate my colleague Austin Scott fighting this battle for years. And really what is at the heart of this is the fact that this program has been out of control. If you look at the levels that they were funded going back to 2008, the program was taking in $800 million. It then in 4 years mushroomed to over $2.2 billion. Today it's hovering around $1.4 billion. So if you just take where it is today, that's a 75% increase in this program in just 7 years. And so the bill just says, let's control this. Let's actually put a cap in place on this program. And there's some people that are talking as if, you know, somebody's trying to take something away from somebody else. And of course, we all ought to recognize where this money's coming from. So when we talk about today, $1.4 billion in this program, that's being paid for by people who own cell phones. So the single mom who's working 2 or 3 jobs to get by, struggling, barely making it, she has seen in just the last 7 years, her portion of the Universal Service Fund, the amount she pays on her cell phone bill, has gone up 80%. 80%. That may be the difference between whether or not she can keep her cell phone or not. And she's paying the freight. And so when we say, let's put a cap on this thing, let's put a limit on it, it's because something is being taken away from somebody. Every time this fee is raised and the FCC comes up with some new idea to spend more money on this program, it's coming out of the pockets of people that are barely struggling to get by. And so when you look at the hearings we've had on the fraud in the program and the duplication in the program, or even just one day the FCC comes up with a new idea for what they want to do to add to this program, you know, we've pointed this out to the FCC commissioners. It's being paid for by hardworking taxpayers that don't have an endless pot of money. And there is not an endless pot of money. And at some point, you got to put a cap on this thing and say,
Gentleman yield?
every other program has a cap.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure, be happy to.
The gentleman, thank you very much. The gentleman mentioned a period of time, 7 or 8 years. Did the gentleman track the upswing of usage of wireless, number one in the country? Because it has grown rapidly, and we know that. I mean, we've had so many discussions in our subcommittee about wireless and its growth, and that's why we need more spectrum and all of that. Secondly, as that growth took place, we were also coming out of the Great Recession.
Right,
So
and if I could
I
reclaim...
think that I just want to point those out, and if you, in making your comments, went back to research both the growth of mobile use across the country and the years of that growth in terms of what was happening with our economy. Thank you very much.
And I appreciate the gentlelady's comments because it points out just what's important here is that as more and more people are able to access technology, you know, technology is not free, it's expensive. America, luckily, is so innovative that we've been able to come up with all kind of new ways to use technology and innovation so that people that aren't wealthy can actually afford it now. And so the problem is, as you get people that are just above poverty, they're in the bottom middle class, maybe they're hardworking blue-collar folks who finally can afford their own cell phone, the Universal Service Fund continues to increase at a way, again, 80% increase in this fund, to the point where now it's forcing people to decide whether or not they can keep the phone because they keep adding more and more charges. FCC's refused to cap this program. We've asked the FCC to cap it. They won't do it. And so Congress is implored to stand up for the people that are paying this bill because somebody's paying this bill. And it's harder and harder for them to pay it every time that, you know, Lifeline has been used for a slush fund by the FCC. You know, so they come up with some kind of whimsical idea, and it's usually on a partisan basis, unfortunately. FCC used to not be partisan. But if they have a partisan vote to say, let's add something else because we want to give something to somebody, the problem is they're taking it away from somebody to give it. And all we're saying is somebody protect the taxpayer that's paying the bill. That's what this bill does. It says, finally, let's re-interject the idea that somebody's actually paying for this, and they've had enough. You know, it used to be don't tax me, don't tax thee, tax the man behind the tree. The tree's falling on the man now, and he's saying enough is enough. Let's put some kind of cap in place so that the taxpayer's protected. The person who's barely making ends meet doesn't have to worry that the FCC is going to come up with more and more ideas that's going to force them to have to give up their cell phone because of some whimsical idea that the FCC has so that it's not any longer a slush fund. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Other members seeking recognition. Gentleman from New Mexico, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can staff tell me when the Universal Service Fund was created?
Explicitly in statute or when the Universal Service Fund was started?
I'm just a regular guy. You explain whatever you need to.
Universal Service.
Oh.
As a concept, it started under the Bell system because you were explicitly subsidizing between high cost and low cost areas for urban and rural. It was explicitly put into statute in the 96 Act.
1984? Is that about the year that it got started?
Yeah, it's when the Bell system was broken up in 1984. It was
Who was president back then?
be Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan was president 1984 when this program got started. How much of the Universal Service Fund today goes to pay for the Lifeline program?
Approximately 1.4 to 1.6 billion, depending on the year.
No. What percentage?
What percentage?
What percentage of the Universal Service Fund that our distinguished whip was describing that is collected on cell phone bills, mobile phone bills, what percentage of the USF goes to pay for Lifeline?
I will admit I'm going to have to do the math to calculate it out. The
Does
high cost-
100%, let me ask the question this way. Does 100% of the USF that's collected on cell phone bills go to the Lifeline program?
No, there's $4 billion or so that goes to the high cost fund, $1.5 billion to low income. I believe the cap on schools and libraries is around $3.9 billion and $400 million for rural health care.
So so we're being clear today, this bill today does not zero out that USF fee on cell phone bills, correct?
That's correct.
So people are still going to pay it?
Yes.
So what are they going to pay for? So what does USF go for? You said something about high cost. What does high cost mean?
The Universal Service Fund is currently broken into 4 funds. The high cost fund goes to subsidize deployment in areas where it's uneconomic to deploy communications networks.
So part of the USF that will not be zeroed out today still requires people that pay their cell phone bills and mobile phone bills that don't get a subsidy to pay for people across America that have higher costs?
That's correct. This bill does not address the high cost fund.
Oh, so people are still going to pay into this fund for people that are vulnerable, for people that have higher costs. So there still will be a subsidy for some people?
Yes, there will still be a universal service fund, and people will still be paying a charge to subsidize the universal service fund.
The only point that I'm trying to make here, Mr. Chairman, is that when we're talking about the collection of the Universal Service Fund, which was created back in 1984 under President Reagan, there was a recognition not only with the breakup of the Bell companies, attributable to the Lifeline program, the Lifeline program that was created in 1984, that was going to be funded through the Universal Service Fund, that there were people in high-cost areas across America. There was a recognition that technology was shifting and changing, that we had to provide support to them. So just so that we understand that application. The other thing, Mr. Chairman, that I pulled up a little earlier was there was a document that was printed on March 3rd, 2014 called The War on Poverty, 50 years later, a House Budget Committee report. And in it, it talks about different programs that are federal programs. And I was surprised. So when I got to page 184 of the report, Universal Service Fund low-income support is actually talked about in this report, then authored by Chairman Ryan. And very surprised again, on page 185, 186, and 187, the Lifeline program is talked about in this report.
Yeah.
So am I to understand that this document, which is called The War on Poverty 50 Years Later, that programs that are listed in here are going to be zeroed out? Is that what this is about?
No, and nobody's saying that.
So how is it in fact then that we are today zeroing out the support for mobile phone services
Well, the gentleman
with the
yield.
Lifeline program? Yes, Mr. Chairman.
We are not zeroing out?
No, sir, the bill would cap the fund at 1.5
No,
billion.
No, Mr. Chairman, over 2 years, the support services for the mobile,
Oh,
for
mobile
wireless
only.
providers will be zeroed out, correct?
No.
Under the,
Yes?
For voice-only service, but not for broadband service.
For voice-only service. So,
Which
in
is-
fact, under the spirit of what was created in 1984 to help people stay connected with family, friends, neighbors, everybody else, that part of the program will be zeroed out in 2 years under the legislation before us today.
It would codify what the FCC did in its order 2 weeks ago on
Will this will zero all of that out, though, as well?
voice-only service.
Yeah.
It would prevent the subsidy to go to voice-only service.
Okay.
Which-
Mr. Chairman, with that, I'll
Gentleman
yield
yield.
you the balance of my time because I have an
Yeah,
amendment that I'm going to offer next as well. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield you the balance.
Yeah, because my understanding is the FCC agrees with that and is phasing it out. And your point is correct. We're not,
FCC's timeline is 5 years, isn't it?
I'm sorry, but in terms of the phase out, the timeline may be different. Yes, I yield that.
Yeah.
But the point is the same in the end. We do it quicker, yes. The point you've made, though, is the subsidies to help low income with phones that have wireless capability, including online. We've talked about the homework gap. A voice-only phone probably doesn't help on the homework gap. You really need to be able to access the internet. We would continue to subsidize that, but we think it shouldn't be an endless subsidy with no cap or fiscal responsibility. It'd be $1.5 billion, $1.5 billion under the cap. And both of our times have expired, but I appreciate the gentleman's thoughtfulness. Others seeking recognition?
Mr. Chairman? Oh, I have an amendment. I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yeah, we still have Ms. Clark's amendment. Any other comments on Ms. Clark's amendment? If not, Chairman calls.
I need to withdraw my point of order.
Okay, the gentleman withdraws his point of order, And with that, we'll ask for a roll call on Ms. Clark's amendment. All in favor will say aye. Those opposed, nay. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Ms. Elmers. Ms. Elmers votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Rush. Ms. DeGette. Mr. Butterfield. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Aye. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Chairman.
Walden votes no.
Chairman
Mr.
Walden
Lance.
votes no. Mr. Lance votes no.
Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield votes aye.
Mr. Butterfield votes aye.
Are there other members seeking to vote? Are there any other members not recorded? If not, the clerk will report the tally of this vote.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, the ayes were 11 and the nays were 17.
The ayes are 11, the nays are 17. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Mexico. For what purpose?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr.
Clerk,
Chairman.
without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
4B. 4B? Very good. Mr. Chairman, according to the Federal Communication Commission's most recent Broadband Progress Report, nearly 40% of rural Americans, 23 million people, lack access to advanced broadband. In my home state, more than 60% of New Mexicans living in rural communities lack access. These numbers are simply unacceptable. They mean too many people are being left behind while the rest of the country races forward. Take a student who doesn't have access to broadband at home. When I was growing up, all you needed was your textbook, a notebook, some paper, and maybe a pencil. But the world has changed. Recently, Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel testified that this committee that roughly 7 in 10 teachers assign homework that requires access to broadband. For students without such access, she said, just getting homework done is hard. The FCC recently took a major step toward addressing what Commissioner Rosenworcel had called the homework gap by modernizing the Lifeline program to offer broadband services. But the Curb Lifeline Act and its hard $1.5 billion cap would undermine this progress and shut out millions of Americans. I'll point out that in a hearing, Commissioner Pai was asked about the cap, and even Commissioner Pai's conservative approach was $1.75 billion, and clearly voted with the Commission closer to this $2 billion cap that they established. All across rural America, this bill would make it harder for seniors to communicate with their doctor, for people to look for a job, for families to connect during an emergency, and for students to get their homework done. That's why I'm offering an amendment that restricts the effectiveness of the cap until the FCC certifies that the cap will not prevent low-income households in rural areas from receiving the Lifeline subsidy at the current subsidy rate, and Congress acts to affirm the report. In closing, let me read you some parts of an editorial that was written by Betsy Hubbard, who is president of the National Grange. The National Grange is the nation's oldest agricultural organization, has a presence in 37 states. She said that you might assume that urban America is where the broadband gap is most severe, but the truth is that rural America is much worse off when it comes to broadband, or more precisely, the lack thereof. The FCC's 2015 Broadband Progress Report found that more than half, 53% of rural Americans lack access to high-speed broadband, and much of our rural communities may lack such access for many years to come. In fact, if you look at a map of the portion of rural America west of the Mississippi River that is served by broadband, you will see what is a high-tech wasteland. That's why those of us who advocate for rural America are so concerned about H.R. 4884, the so-called Curb Lifeline Abuse Act, which is being marked up in the House this week or next. For low-income rural Americans, this bill is a double-barreled problem. It would take away some of what the FCC just did on broadband affordability and would phase out subsidies for voice-only service for mobile, untimely killing wireless Lifeline cell phone access. Now, no one opposes fiscal responsibility in the Lifeline program and efforts to reduce waste, but it's misleading and unfair to trade on anecdotal illustrations of past problems that have long since been addressed. Not only has the FCC in recent years enacted sweeping reforms tackling concerns about the Lifeline program, but it also took additional steps last month to make sure that cell phone and broadband services would be even more efficient. And Mr. Chairman, if I might be able to submit this editorial into the record.
Without objection.
With that, Mr. Chairman, again, I would hope that there is support for this amendment today as we look at these programs and especially into rural parts of the country, see how we can work with this, understand how this cap was devised, the methodology behind it, what it's going to do, what it's not going to do, who it's going to cut off, who it's not going to cut off. But again, even Commissioner Pai testified before this very subcommittee and said that he would suggest $1.75 billion, but then later in questioning and in actions and votes that were taken, supported something closer to $2 billion. And so, Mr. Chairman, I hope we're able to figure out today even where that $1.5 billion cap was devised, the methodology, and trying to understand who it's going to cut off and who it's still going to be able to support. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Are there members seeking recognition? If not, I would recognize myself, to strike the last word in opposition to the amendment and yield back. Are there other members seeking recognition? Seeing none, the vote now arises on the Lujan amendment. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, nay, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Ms. Elmers. Ms. Elmers votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Ms. Clark. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Gett. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Chairman Walden.
Walden votes no. Are there members not recorded? Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie.
Mr. Guthrie votes no.
Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance.
Mr. Lance votes no.
Gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo.
Mr. Pompeo votes no.
Gentleman from Florida, are you recorded? Yeah.
Mr. Bilirakis votes
Gentleman
no.
votes no. Gentleman from Texas, you are not. Gentleman from Texas votes no. Are there other members who are not recorded? Seeing. You're not? How, gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark, how would you like to be recorded? You
Mrs.
sure?
Clark votes aye.
Ms. Clark votes aye. Are there other members who are not recorded on the vote? If not, the clerk will report the tally of the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, The ayes were 11 and the noes were 17.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Chair recognizes gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney. For what purpose does he seek recognition?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment, and without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. This amendment will not allow the cap to go into effect until the FCC certifies that the cap does not keep veterans from receiving the subsidy at its current rate, and Congress acts on the report. Over the last year, more than 1.4 million veterans reported that they are living below the poverty line. This means that 7% of all veterans are eligible to participate in the Lifeline program. Nearly 989,000 of those veterans are between the ages of 18 and 64. The FCC's recent vote to update Lifeline to include access to broadband is critical for these veterans to be able to apply for jobs and obtain the necessary retraining and education they need after returning from service. Now, on the other hand, 443,000 of those veterans who are Lifeline eligible are over the age of 65, and for many of these veterans, they face serious health problems. Lifeline is the only way they are able to obtain help during emergencies. If veterans are unable to receive Lifeline funds, they won't have access to these basic needs and services. This is why we must make sure the cap will not prevent veterans from receiving Lifeline funds at the current rate. Mr. Chairman, I hear your reluctance to wait for the FCC report. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I hear you. If you have a better way to make sure that veterans are not going to be hurt by this cap, I'd certainly like to hear it. With that, I'll urge my members to vote for this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Are there other members seeking recognition? Seeing none, recognize myself in opposition to the amendment, and I'll yield back the remainder of my time. Are there other members seeking recognition? Seeing none, the question now before the committee is on approval of Mr. McNerney's amendment. All those in favor will say aye. Those opposed, no. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Ms. Elmers. Ms. Elmers votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes no. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Loebsack. Mr. Loebsack votes aye. Mr. Rush. Ms. DeGette. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Chairman Walden. Chairman Walden votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no.
There are other members not recorded who seek to be recorded. Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 11 and the noes were 17.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments? Seeing none, the question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 4884 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, nay. And the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Ms. Blackburn. Ms. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Ms. Elmers. Ms. Elmers votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Doyle votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Yarmouth? Mr. Yarmouth votes no. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes no. Mr. Loebsack? Mr. Loebsack votes no. Mr. Rush? Ms. DeGette? Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield votes no. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes no. Mr. McNeary? Mr. McNeary votes no. Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Pallone votes no. Chairman Walden?
Walden votes aye. Are there other members wishing to be recorded? Seeing none, the clerk will report the
Mr.
tally.
Chairman, on that vote, the ayes were 17 and the nays were 11.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation approved by the subcommittee today. So ordered. Without objection, subcommittee stands adjourned.